Johnny's hand trembled over the cue cards, the orchestra went silent, and 20 million viewers held their breath because Carson was about to share the last words George Burns said before he died. The Tonight Show studio was bathed in that familiar warm glow. March 1996. Johnny Carson had been off the air for 4 years, but tonight he'd agreed to a rare special appearance, a tribute show honoring legends of comedy. The audience was electric with anticipation. Seeing Johnny behind that desk again felt like coming home. He'd done his monologue. The laughs came easy, natural, like he'd never left. Doc Severinsen and the band were tight as ever. Ed McMahon's laugh still punctuated every joke perfectly. Everything was exactly as it should be. But then Johnny reached for a specific cue card. Not one prepared by the writers. One he'd written himself in the dressing room an hour before taping. His hand hovered over it for just a moment too long. Doc noticed first. The maestro had spent 30 years reading Johnny's subtle signals. He raised one hand, and the band faded to silence. The audience sensed the shift, that immediate change in atmosphere when something real was about to happen. Johnny looked directly into camera one. No smile. No setup. Just Johnny Carson, suddenly looking every bit of his 70 years, holding a piece of cardboard that contained words he'd been carrying for 24 years. George Burns died yesterday, Johnny said quietly. He was 100 years old. And before I say anything else tonight, I need to tell you about something he told me in 1972. Something I've never spoken about publicly. Something that haunted me, in the best possible way, for the rest of my life. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. To understand what happened next, you need to understand 1972. Johnny Carson was at the absolute peak of his power. The Tonight Show was the most watched program in late-night television. He was making more money than he'd ever imagined possible. He had the best writers, the best guests, the best time slot. Everything he touched turned to gold. He was also miserable. Not the obvious kind of miserable. He still did the show 5 nights a week. He still made the audience laugh. He still chatted with celebrities and musicians like it was effortless. But something inside was hollow. Empty. The job that had once filled him with joy had become mechanical. His second marriage was falling apart. His relationship with his sons was strained. He drank too much after tapings, sitting alone in his dressing room long after everyone else had gone home. He'd started having panic attacks before shows, brief moments where he couldn't breathe, couldn't remember why any of this mattered. Nobody knew. Johnny Carson was too good at the mask. Too professional to let it slip. Even Ed, who knew him better than almost anyone, only saw glimpses. One Tuesday afternoon in September 1972, Johnny was in his office at NBC in Burbank. It was 3 hours before taping. He was staring at the script for that night's monologue, and the words might as well have been in a foreign language. He couldn't focus. Couldn't find the rhythm. Everything felt flat. His secretary knocked. "Mr. Carson? George Burns is here to see you." Johnny looked up, confused. "I don't have George scheduled. He doesn't have an appointment. He said he was in the building and wanted to say hello. Should I?" No. Send him in." George Burns shuffled into the office a moment later, that eternal cigar in his hand, his gentle smile in place. He was 76 years old and still performing regularly, still working, still one of the sharpest minds in show business. "Johnny boy," George said, settling into a chair without being asked. "You look terrible." Johnny forced a laugh. "Thanks, George. You always know how to make a guy feel good. I'm serious." George's eyes were kind but penetrating. "You look like a man who's forgotten why he started." The comment hit Johnny like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to deny it, to make a joke, to deflect. But something about George's expression stopped him. "How do you know?" Johnny asked quietly. "Because I looked like you in 1958, George said. "Gracie had just retired. The show was over." I thought I was finished. I'd spent 38 years doing the same act, and suddenly I had nothing. I forgot that it wasn't about the act. It was never about the act. Johnny leaned forward. Then what was it about? George took a long drag on his cigar, considering. When he spoke, his voice was soft but absolutely certain. It's about the moment when you make one person forget their troubles. Just one. Doesn't matter if it's the person sitting at home who just lost their job, or the kid in the audience who's scared about school tomorrow, or the old lady who can't sleep. When you make that one person laugh, really laugh, from somewhere deep, you're doing something that matters. But the minute you forget that person exists, the minute it becomes about you instead of them, you're finished. You might keep working. You might keep getting laughs. But you're already dead inside. Johnny sat very still. How do I remember? You look for them, George said simply. Every show. You find one face in that audience. You pick someone. And you do that show for them. Not for the network. Not for the ratings. Not even for yourself. For that one person who needs to laugh tonight. He stood up, patting Johnny's shoulder. And Johnny? When you find yourself sitting in an office at 3 in the afternoon, staring at jokes that don't mean anything anymore? That's when you remember that somewhere out there, someone is having the worst day of their life. And tonight, for 90 minutes, you get to make that day a little bit better. That's not a job. That's a gift. George walked to the door, then turned back. One more thing. This gift? It doesn't last forever. Someday you'll do your last show. And when that day comes, you'll wish you'd appreciated every single night. Even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones. He left. Johnny sat alone in his office, George's words echoing. That night, Johnny did something he'd never done before. During the commercial break after his monologue, he stepped to the edge of the stage and looked at the audience. Really looked. Third row, left side, there was a middle-aged woman sitting alone. She looked tired. Worn down. But when Johnny had delivered a particular joke during the monologue, she'd laughed, really laughed, and for just a second, her whole face had transformed. Johnny made eye contact with her. Just a brief moment. Then he went back to his mark for the next segment. He did that show for her. Every joke, every bit, every interview. In his mind, he was talking to that one tired woman in the third row who needed to laugh. It changed everything. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The panic attack stopped. Not immediately, but gradually. The drinking became occasional instead of nightly. Johnny started actually listening to his guests again instead of just waiting for his next line. The show got better, everyone noticed, though nobody could quite say why. And every single night for the next 20 years, Johnny would find one person. Sometimes it was someone in the audience. Sometimes it was a crew member. Sometimes it was just an imagined person at home watching alone. But he'd pick someone, and he'd do that show for them. He never told anyone about George's visit. Not even Ed. It was private. Sacred. The thing that kept him going through 2 more divorces, through the deaths of friends, through contract negotiations and network politics, and all the machinery of television that threatened to grind the joy out of it. In 1992, when Johnny did his final Tonight Show, he ended with a simple tribute to everyone who'd made the show possible. But his last words, before the credits rolled, were directed at the camera, directly at everyone watching at home. I hope I was able to make you laugh. Even just once. That's all I ever wanted to do. 20 million people heard those words. Nobody knew they were an echo of George Burns' advice from 20 years earlier. And now, in March 1996, standing behind that desk for the tribute special, Johnny held the cue card he'd written in his dressing room. The one with George's words transcribed in his own handwriting. Backstage, producers were begging him to continue, but he didn't. The control room was in chaos. This wasn't in the script. Johnny was supposed to introduce the next segment. Commercial break was coming up. But Johnny wasn't moving. He was just standing there, staring at that cue card, his hand trembling slightly. The director's voice crackled in Ed McMahon's earpiece. "Ed, can you—" Ed held up one hand. "Wait. Let him go." Johnny looked up from the card, directly into the camera. "George died yesterday at 100 years old. And I need you all to know something. Everything good I ever did on this show, every moment that mattered, came from a conversation I had with him 24 years ago." He paused, composing himself. The audience was absolutely silent. Even the crew had stopped moving. "He told me to find one person every night. One person who needed to laugh. And to do the show for them. Not for the ratings. Not for the network. For that one person having the worst day of their life." Johnny's voice cracked. "I did that. Every single night for 20 years I found someone. And it saved me. It made this job, this gift, mean something." He held up the cue card so the camera could see it, though the handwriting was too small to read on screen. "This is what I wrote down after he left my office that day. I've kept it all these years. Find the one who needs to laugh. Do it for them. This gift doesn't last forever." But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny carefully, deliberately, tore the cue card in half. The audience gasped. Ed started to rise from his chair, concerned. But Johnny smiled, that genuine smile that millions had come to love. "I'm tearing this up because I don't need it anymore. It's not written on a card. It's written in here." He tapped his chest, over his heart. "George gave me this advice when I was drowning and didn't know it. And I'm passing it on now. To every comedian, every performer, every person who's ever stood on a stage or behind a camera, find the one person who needs what you have to give. Do it for them. That's the whole secret. That's everything." He looked directly at camera one, speaking to 20 million people as if each one was alone in a room with him. Some of you watching tonight are having the worst day of your life. You don't know how you're going to get through tomorrow. You feel alone. Invisible. Like nobody sees you. His voice was soft, but it carried perfect clarity. "I see you. George taught me to see you. And I'm telling you, it gets better. Not immediately. Not easily. But it does. And in the meantime, find something that makes you laugh. Find someone who needs you to show up. Be the person for someone else that George was for me." The studio audience rose to their feet. Not the polite standing ovation of television protocol. Real, thunderous applause. People were crying openly. Doc Severinsen wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Ed McMahon's voice, that legendary voice, could be heard saying, yes sir, thick with emotion. Johnny stood at his desk, overwhelmed, holding the two halves of that torn cue card. Cameramen were crying behind their equipment. Producers in the control room had given up trying to maintain the schedule. After a long moment, Johnny raised one hand, and the applause gradually faded. "One more thing," he said quietly. "George's last words to me, the last time I spoke to him on the phone 3 weeks ago, were this: 'Johnny boy, did you do it? Did you find them every night?'" Johnny's voice broke completely. "I told him yes. I promised him I had. And he said good? Then you didn't waste it. You didn't waste the gift." He looked down at the torn pieces of the cue card. "I'm going to keep these pieces. I'm going to frame them. And I'm going to remember that the greatest gift George Burns ever gave me wasn't career advice. It was permission to care. Permission to make this job about something bigger than myself." Johnny placed the two halves of the cards side by side on his desk. The camera zoomed in on them, George's words and Johnny's handwriting, now separated but still whole. "Thank you, George," Johnny said simply. "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For teaching me to see others. For reminding me that this gift doesn't last forever, so we better not waste a single night. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The framed cue card hangs in the Smithsonian today. Museum visitors stand in front of it, reading those words Johnny wrote in 1972. And somewhere, in reruns playing late at night, Johnny Carson is still doing what George taught him, finding the one person who needs to laugh, and giving them 90 minutes of grace.